Well, hello, viewers out there of the Erudite Bibliophile with Wanderlust. Welcome to our first author virtual chat of 2021 with none other than Joy Jordan Lake about her book, Under a Gilded Moon. So if you could hold up that beautiful copy for us. Oh, so close. And I wanted to say thank you, of course, for spending the afternoon with us, and just warmest welcomes to you, Joy.
Thank you so much for having me, Erin.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to tell everybody a little bit about how I discovered your book. I actually had just finished reading Fiona Davis's Lions of Fifth Avenue. Yes. And so I had joined a virtual author chat that was called Great Historical or Best-Selling Historical Fiction Authors Share Their Inspirations. The one you did with Ariel Lawhon, Jane Healy, Lauren Willick, and Fiona Davis. So you were on there. It was like share inspiration.
Good for you. I can't believe you remembered all 5 people. That's good for you.
Yeah, it was something like share inspiration from sources you didn't know or you wouldn't know. And so you were talking about your book, Under a Gilded Moon, and I was like, I have to read that book. When you started talking about like the premise of the story and the details of the story, I was like blown away. And so I was hoping maybe you could share a brief kind of intro to maybe the viewers and readers who maybe aren't familiar with the book so that they can kind of have the same experience that I had where they get to hear about this book and are blown away and are going to like run to their local favorite indie bookstores or rush online and get this book like I did because it is fabulous.
Thank you, Erin. My goodness, to be part of the PR team. You're so good. Thank you. Well, that was such a fun panel. I love all those women and their books, and Lions of Fifth Avenue was just, I went on a Fiona Davis, just kind of a binge this summer reading a bunch of books and just had such a good time. She's great. So, but this book, I'll just give you the basic premise. And then if you have, because I could talk forever about like where the story so ask questions you want. Nothing's off the table. But the basic premise is that Carrie McGregor is a young woman who grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina and has had the chance, because she's very bright, to go to New York on scholarship. She's there and has had 2 years of college and is called back home by telegram because her father is dying. And she's had a very troubled relationship with her father, who is an alcoholic and has been gone most of her growing up. Very troubled relationship. So it's one of those duty, and yet she feels responsible for a younger brother and sister who are twins, and very torn and very worried that this will be a complete derailing of her dreams. And in fact, it very likely will be, going back there, and she goes anyway because she feels she has to and owes it to family duty, and goes back to the Blue Ridge where she's from. Meanwhile, coming down on the same train are visitors to George Vanderbilt's Biltmore estate, which was just being completed at that time. To this day, it's the largest private residence in the United States. Has 250 rooms at that time, but at its apex, it had 125,000 acres. Just this massive thing. It's this stunning. If you've never been, have you ever been?
Yes, I loved it.
Okay. Told me that you had, but for anyone who hasn't, it's just in the stunning setting, and it's the house itself is French Renaissance chateau, and it's just this castle. But for the locals, you might imagine, this was a time when the trains were new. People were just coming to this very remote part of the mountains. A lot of Northerners were coming in for, this is when lots of people still died of TB and other diseases. So people would come and stay in these gorgeous Victorian inns, and they had beautiful wraparound breathing porches, they were called. And so these wealthy Northerners would come and just breathe the fresh mountain air, which is how George Vanderbilt fell in love with this place and decided to build his castle, essentially his American castle there. But Carrie McGregor, to me, and there's a whole story that I'll be happy to tell if you want me to. for sort of how she popped into my imagination, but she's the person who stands in both worlds. She both fits in with the educated Northerners and in some ways is very sympathetic to that world and is also fiercely loyal to her Appalachian roots and her family farm that she does not want under any circumstances to give up. But her farm is right there in the area that George Vanderbilt is needing to buy up all the land to make a part of Biltmore Estate. And her farm and two other ones are the last ones that have refused to sell. And so there are these kind of islands in the middle of this huge Biltmore Estate. So that's part of the tension as she comes home. She wants nothing to do with Biltmore or any of the Vanderbilts. So of course, she's forced to have contact with Vanderbilts because that's what makes a good story, right?
Yeah. The clashing and the colliding of these two cultures.
Exactly. So it was.
I was going to say, so when you're writing this novel, and as you mentioned, you're writing about the Biltmore, this, America's largest private residence, this chateau-inspired, stunning setting. You're writing about the Vanderbilts, who are this storied family of American upper class society. They're the symbol of like Gilded Age millionaires. Do you ever get intimidated as an author to write about like some place and some people like these where they have so much like celebrity status and there is such like a wealth of information and knowledge out there about them, and perhaps even other works and books and pieces that have already been written about them? Like, does that ever intimidate you, or does it ever hold you even back from writing about certain places, or how do you come to terms with that?
That's very intuitive of you to even think about, how an author feels writing about that. And that's exactly, the kind of thing you have to work through in your mind, because you, on the one hand, you want to be very careful with people's reputations and legacies, to me, at least, I don't want to trash someone who doesn't deserve trashing. I want to really try to be true to who a historical character really was and true to a place. And so I wanted to represent the clash of cultures. And for example, in Asheville there, one of my three kids, two are biological, one's adopted, and my youngest was born in China. And so I thought, well, this, one of the many things I tried to do in terms of being true to a place or people, to check out, were there any Asians? Were there any Chinese people living in Asheville in the Gilded Age, and turned out there was one guy that I found in the archives. And so he's represented in the novel. And so things like that, you want to try to be historically accurate. And with George Vanderbilt, that's a great question, because you're right, the Vanderbilt legacy is huge. And I'm a big Anderson Cooper fan. So I would, he's a descendant of the Vanderbilt. So I would even picture Anderson. What would Anderson think?
Right.
So you can't write like that if you're thinking someone's sort of looking over your shoulder and going, oh, no, don't make my great-great-grandfather look bad,
Right.
So I really tried to be open to, as I read about the Vanderbilts and that whole heritage and the family, starting with the Commodore, who was the patriarch of the family, who really amassed the wealth in the beginning, starting out as a ferry boat captain. I really tried to keep an open mind about George Vanderbilt, and really tried to be braced for perhaps really not liking him if he, seemed like one of the robber barons of the Gilded Age. He'd inherited all this money, and his brothers and sisters, really, he was the youngest of 8. And really some of his brothers and sisters-in-law, really use their monies in ways that most of us would find pretty off-putting these days. There were parties up in Newport, Rhode Island, gorgeous cottages up there.
Yeah.
Another must-see for anyone who hasn't been to Newport. But they would have parties, where the guest would come out and there'd be sand all over the front lawn, these gorgeous lawns that back up to the cliffs that go down to the Atlantic Ocean. They're so gorgeous. But they would have servants put sand in the lawn. And then one of the party games was to come out, and the guests dug through the sand to find diamonds and rubies and emeralds. And, if you can imagine. And at another party, the guests all received as party favors. One of their party favors was a cigar that was $100 bill rolled, that was the paper of the cigar, which even today is a little extravagant, right?
Yeah.
But we're talking Gilded Age,
Right.
the amount of time. So that sort of thing. This was the culture that he swam in, George swam in. And he just it was fun doing research about him. He just never bought into it. He was a little more, and I really felt like I sort of bonded with him because I was sick a lot as a kid, and he was sick a lot as a kid. So he just read all the time, and he traveled a lot, mostly with his mom when he was younger. And those were his passions. He loved art. He loved books. He loved thinking about philanthropy. He gave a lot of money away. And and this was intriguing because this is a conversation in our culture today. How do you give money in a way that doesn't hurt more than it helps? And he was fascinated by that whole conversation, even back then. How do you give money in such a way that it creates more wealth for the people you're giving it to, and not just, it's not just charity. How do you invest in a culture? And he really thought about that in terms of the Appalachian Mountains and the people. Even though he was displacing a lot of these families, he also invested heavily in the culture, in a school to help train the young people. And so really fascinating, the conflict. So you can both sympathize with people who would have been very resentful of him and his wealth coming in, buying up all the land. And you can also imagine people being very grateful too, who had struggled to survive as farmers in this very difficult mountain soil. And here was a chance to have a steady income. So fascinating. But I really ended up really liking him. He thought about becoming an Episcopal priest, ended up not doing that, but and there are all kinds of great stories in the archives about him where one kitchen maid apparently was serving a platter, or she was bringing out a platter to the table and dropped it, shattered everything, ruined the food. And apparently there were some guests present when this happened. And he just quietly said, come see me tomorrow at a certain time. And she just knew she would be sacked, absolutely knew it. And when she showed up, he just told her it was okay and gave her another position, which is apparently he was a good business person, but also very kind. So, and he loved horses, had this enormous barn, as you saw, this enormous stable that you see when you go to Biltmore. So that was part of my bonding with him. I love the fact that he was a horse person and a dog person and a book person. So that was fun. But he's really not the main character. He's very much that relieved a little pressure for me too, was to make him a secondary character, so that the words I put in his mouth, I tried to make fit with what I had learned of his character. But I certainly did feel that pressure of knowing that the people who run Biltmore Estate were not going to be happy if he turned out to be a bit villainous, which he doesn't. But I really tried to keep an open mind in case he really was a bit of a one of these tycoons who just was ruthless, but thankfully he's a good secondary character.
You're like, whew. So when you write a book where, like you said, some of these figures are so prominent, when you submit it, is there people who will go through and just double check your research or some of those kind of key facts just to kind of be safe before they put it out there? Or do you get like letters from people after the fact to be like, well, that wasn't something, that wasn't the case? Or how does that work when you're, like you said, writing about such a prominent, historical figure or place or, thing like that?
You absolutely have readers who are very invested wherever you're writing about, whatever city or whatever, or the accents, getting the words just right. Fortunately, a good publisher tries to give you an editor who can catch anything you might miss. And so, for example, my editor for this book was David Downing. He's a great guy, wonderful editor. But he used to be a hunter when he was younger. And I'm not a gun person at all. Yeah. So I checked out all the guns that appeared in the book. I checked out, of course, done the research to make sure that that particular gun existed, so a Winchester rifle or, and I probably even, but it existed in 1895, fine, done, check it off the list. No, that was not going to do for this guy. He was like, no, here's how you hunt quail. You'd never gun, you'd never use, not even wrong dog, wrong, wrong approach to quail hunting. And so he sent me packing to go do my research on quail hunting, exactly how, how does the dog operate? What kind of guns and, how do you, so it was really funny. So that's golden. You don't want a reader. We all have our little interest, you don't have a reader stuck on, oh, she didn't get that right. What else did she get?
Exactly.
And that's great when you have those people you can go to, experts you can check things out with. So, and sometimes it's, I try to, anything I know to question myself on, I certainly try to go and do good research, but sometimes something like that, you don't even know to check yourself. So it's great when you have other eyes on it to help keep you honest.
So that check and balance system. So that probably needs a little pressure knowing like, okay, there's going to be 1, 2, 3 edits after that. That's going to find these fine tunes, these little parts.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Because things strike different people.
Yeah. And so I was going to kind of put forth a quote that you had said that I thought was perfect in the way of kind of describing of kind of how you beautifully and artfully depicted some of the messages of Under a Gilded Moon. And so the quote was that you said, "In all my writing, I tend to be drawn to little known historical events, to humor as well as tragedy, and to social issues and those big existential questions. The human capacity for brutality and bigotry, for example, as well as for remarkable courage and forgiveness." And the reason why I kind of picked that quote is because, yes, you have this wonderful historical mystery of this whodunit murder, set in this backdrop of the stunning Biltmore and the vast, magnificent Blue Ridge Mountains. And even that would be enough for a reader to kind of like get lost in the pages and be absorbed and be transported. But then you added this extra layer where you tackled the prejudices and racism against immigrants, like the Chinese and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1880, like the Italians and the lynchings of 1891 in New Orleans, and the injustices and discrimination against Jews and Blacks of that time. So I felt like, and then on top of all that, it's at a crossroads even now, where here over 100 years later, we're still in a period of, unrest and suffering caused by some of those who do believe that certain races and cultures are, have an inferiority in, intelligence, and they're weaker and things like that. So I just did, if you could kind of talk about, like I said, it sounds like you infuse into your writing, yes, you're doing this historical mystery to draw people in, and you can still get lost in the pages, but then there's this deeper meaning and deeper message that you're putting forth at the same time.
You're my favorite kind of reader, Erin. People who like the different, that's what I love to read too, where there are lots of layers of, I love to learn things when I'm reading even a novel, learn history. And to me, that's so striking. And it's a challenge as a writer to make sure. So thank you for your kind words, because you want to try to make sure the story comes first. It's not a history book, and it's not a sermon, and it's not a social justice speech. And it's, and so any of those a reader's gonna balk at, go, no, I wanted a story. That's, I got this book because of the story, not, if I want those other things, I'll go over there and get those. But that's what fascinates me, is that kind of history and looking at the, different time periods and what were they thinking about? What were they struggling with? And just like we have our struggles and our cultural debates, and what were theirs, and what are the parallels with today, and what's different? And in what ways, do we see progress? And in what ways do we think, oh my gosh, that sounds exactly like what today. So that was very striking when I was trying to decide whether to set, I knew I wanted to write about the Biltmore estate, and I was trying to decide whether to set it in 1895, 96, when it was first opening, and the construction was first finished, or during World War II. And there's a reason for that. But anyway, I went with the earlier time, and just kind of plunging in, going, okay, I have a place, but what's my story and what's the setting? And kind of plunging into the 1890s and trying to figure out what were people thinking about or arguing about, fighting about, or excited about. What was the new technology? What was and that was what was so striking. As you mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and with a daughter who's Chinese,
right?
Just the impact of thinking, seriously, the kinds of things that were being said about people who were Chinese at that time, just, would curl your hair. I mean, and my husband's Italian, and same thing with the Italians. I mean, just chilling, just this kind of rhetoric that makes Southern Italians, not Northern Italians, but Southern Italians, just viewing them as subhuman, and this, fear of people who are Asian, or people who are Southern Italian, or people who have darker skin, or so it was striking, and to me it was, I like to think I know a little bit about history, but you can I didn't realize the extent to which the sort of American intelligentsia, the elite, the academics of that time, were in some cases the most virulently. I mean, it's just chilling, where you can read the president of MIT in the mid 1890s. I mean, sounds like, he was a white supremacist, and his language is just chilling, and on and on. And so that's a good reminder. And one of the historical characters in this novel was someone I had never heard of, named Madison Grant. Had you ever heard of him before?
No, that was actually going to be my next question, because you had said somewhere that many of your characters are these like obscure people now, but who like influenced history. And I was just going to ask you, like, if you were shocked when you researched and discovered this Madison Grant, because here it's this guy who wrote this book that centered around views of eugenics and master race, and that Hitler wrote a fan letter to him and called that Grant's book his Bible. And he was like friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and he knew the Vanderbilts. He was a force of land preservation and wildlife preservation with the national parks and the American bison. And I was like, how did he fall off the pages of history? How was he obscure with all of that background? Plus, it was scary to think he had those views and he was running in the same circles as Roosevelt. I was like,
right. I felt the same way, and just the complexity of human beings. Here we can point to a number of things he did that we still enjoy today. Glacier National Park. He was part of making that happen. He founded the Bronx Zoo, which I've never been to, but I think it still exists. He saved the American buffalo. I think you just said that. Things that are sort of iconic in our culture. But as you said, and land preservation, was this big deal to him. But somehow and it sort of makes sense if you think about how his brain twisted from the original noble goal of preserving and conserving land, and trying to make sure, with all the change that was happening, the railroads and the this and the that, that we didn't lose the pristine beauty of the West, the American West. And so, but somehow he went from that to also wanting to conserve culture as he knew it. He came from this New York family that was descended from men who fought in the Revolutionary War. And so he was very, very proud of his heritage. And he looked around New York at the time, and, it was changing fast. It was, tenement housing. You can, this is the same era where you can read about just all the struggles with tenement housing and disease. And what do we do with this immigrant population so that we don't have children who are malnourished, and what do we do about education? And, all these conversations were going on. And a city like New York was just struggling to, find its footing, to change in all the good ways, and still make it so that it was a good, livable city. And he looked around New York, and instead of seeing excitement and, kind of the melting pot,
Yeah.
he was terrified because he thought, okay, white people are losing control here. And so he, as it began to do more and more research on eugenics, in this kind of pseudoscience, and got very involved with the pseudoscience. And as you said, wrote this book called Passing of the Great Race, Passing of the Great Race, where he lines out that, and so it's absolutely chilling. And as you said, Hitler in the 1920s ended up writing him a fan when it was published, I think in 1926, but ends up writing him a fan letter, saying, your book is my Bible. So this guy in the 1890s is starting down that road in terms of his thought process. It's before he's published his book, but he's starting to veer off track of land preservation to these other sort of deeply troubling views. So, but yeah, I'm with you. Like, how did he fall out of the history books? Because, yeah,
Well, it's fair to think too that some of those seeds were that started with Hitler and the Third Reich. How some of those seeds were like spawned from our own soil. Like that's
right.
Like about you talked about the connections with that. Was it the LNA, which I had not knew about before, the organization in France? I don't know if you can speak on that.
Right. That was very anti-Semitic, an organization in France, which again, at the time was the Ligue Nationale, and they again drew from the elite. It's very much not that all the elite were by any means involved, but that many of the people most involved with this very anti-Semitic organization, many of them were from the elite and aristocracy. And so I'm with you. It's very humbling, when we Americans love our Hollywood movies where the World War II Germans are the bad guys, and you get to sit back and thinking, like how could people have been so twisted and cruel and let ourselves off the hook? And it's very humbling to realize, as you say, a lot of the seeds were coming from this country, from England, from France. It's a lot of the eugenics research really was coming, so it wasn't like, Adolf Hitler just dropped from the sky fully formed. He was influenced by all this, including by folks here in this country. So yeah, it's
And what is it like when you're like researching and you drop upon like a bombshell like that, or you're finding out like this information that you're like, whoa, like, are you just like, I can't tell too many people because I'm about to put it in this book, but I've got to talk to somebody. Like, did anybody know about this? Like, this is crazy.
Yeah. See, next time I'll call you and I'll go,
yes. I'm sure some of these are like, I have to talk to somebody about
this. Right. Well, I've got a great husband, so he likes to say his other job title is head research assistant. So he's a great person to talk
I'll
with.
be a secondary.
So that is great. But you feel like just being that crazy person walking around your neighborhood, kind of speaking to strangers, going, "Did you know?" Because you do sort of look around and think. I've done that with every book. I've come upon something with each book historically where I've truly thought, now how can this be that I didn't know this? And how many other people are like me who didn't know this and should have? But yeah, Madison Grant's, and a number of the characters through here, the lynching in New Orleans that plays a part of the mystery, lynching of a number of Italians, Southern Italians. Had no idea. I knew there was some in my husband's family. They sort of tell grim jokes, sort of against Italians as sort of that, look how it used to be, like look how people used to look down on Italians. And so they'll kind of tell jokes on themselves, or sort of, tell family stories where on the one hand, kind of, can you believe people used to think we were all the mafia, but then they'll tell the story about, an uncle who owned a barbershop, but
Right.
his wife was always in furs and drove fancy cars, you know, and so they'll tell stories, you know, where you go, ha. Um, but of course, it's all just ha ha these days, where Italians are gorgeous and, you know, viewed as kind of like, oh, yeah, you know, wish I had those good, you know, lovely dark hair and good looks. Um, and not so at all during this time, where you know, it was, the assumptions were you were a murderer, you were, you know, you would steal, you would, you know, you were violent, you were, not to be trusted, you didn't want these people in your cities. I mean, it's a good lesson. And but trying not to, it sounds like you share the struggle of not getting so pulled into the research that you end up writing just a history book, because you're still trying to, you know, still these characters to life and tell a story. So, so that's that balance.
Well, and you even take it one step further. Instead of just like being a straight like historical fiction novel, you're also trying to throw this mystery in of like trying to solve this whodunit murder on top of all other stuff. So I mean, it's like that adds the whole other layer. So, but I was gonna say, speaking of characters, we talked about Madison Grant, but I also read this article that I just thought was so interesting that you did recently, where it was for the women's books. And it was this article where authors had to interview their own characters. And so you spoke of her somewhat today, but you interviewed your character, Carrie McGregor. And it was just so interesting. I thought that is going to be like my new favorite question or thought to authors, because I'm like, how interesting to interview your own characters. And so I thought, well, why don't we steer down that path a little bit? Let's pretend they asked you for a follow-up interview. What character are you going to pick now, and what questions would you maybe ask them, or what topics would you want to discuss if you had to do another character?
Oh my goodness. Okay, great question. And I love that isn't that brilliant? I love that question. I'd never heard that before. And that was fun. That was fun to work on. I'd never thought of it.
And I loved your interview with her.
Oh, I really liked her. You know, these characters become real in your head. So I really liked who she was,
Yeah.
and her strength. She let's see, what other character. I was very fond of I was very fond of the Lily character. And I love Edith Wharton. I love her books, but her novel House of Mirth, the ending just always pains me. When I used to teach literature, I just would always, you know, when we got to the ending, and my students would always be so mad and say, "Why is American literature always end sadly?" I'm sorry to spoil. I read the book, but and I would always think, good question. Why do, you know, Americans tend to be very like, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and, you know, pretend that you're happy even when you're not, sort of, you know,
American optimism.
Right. American optimism, right. It is true that much of our classic literature is can be pretty dark. And of course that book is, but so I guess that was my way of both doing a tribute to Edith Wharton, but also giving the actual, you know, assuming that if this person was based on an actual character in Edith Wharton's life, bringing that person to life and giving her a different possible ending, but still making her this young woman who, the character in my novel, is comes from a wealthy family, but there's this scandal, and she isn't even entirely sure about her father's involvement or not, but she's afraid the scandal is really going to break open over her head right at the time when she needs to find a good match, and she needs to find a wealthy husband. And so she's sort of halfway set her cap at George Vanderbilt, but also has enough spunk and independence that she's not going to grovel. She's not going to throw herself at him. She's still maintaining that independence. And but I just liked, she's not necessarily an admirable character. She can be pretty ruthless in getting what she wants, but I just sort of enjoyed her strength and when push came to shove, some integrity in situations where she needed it. So, and just her passion. So she'd be a fun person to interview, I think, and maybe ask her a few very hard questions about, what were you thinking when,
Yeah. Or maybe some details about her relationship with Sal or something.
Yeah. Happens
Some
in this.
girl gossip.
Exactly. How steamy did things get back there? Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
right.
and I feel like between her and Carrie, I'm like, put them on something and they're unstoppable. I feel like if you had them behind you in your friend group, I mean, what couldn't you,
Right. She's that person in your friend group that you're a little bit in awe of, and you don't want to be exactly like her, but you're kind of like, well, you go, girl.
Yeah, she gets it done.
Yeah.
Well, and I also thought, talking about characters, how important to you is the setting of the book? Because when you're writing a story, because the place in this book was almost like a main character in itself, as much as these protagonists like Carrie was, the misty, magnificent Blue Ridge Mountains, the stunning chateau-inspired Biltmore. I mean, I felt like had as much of a significant impact on the characters and profound effect on the story, as almost like a character in itself. So I didn't know if you could talk about kind of the setting or the place when it takes this like centralized theme or character where it almost is right there with the people of the book.
Oh, I'm glad you felt that way, because that's I love those mountains, and I grew up.
Yeah, I felt like this was like your love letter to like the mountains, that area. I mean, you really truly captured like the essence of that.
Oh, well, thanks. I do love the mountains. I tried to do the same. My last novel was set in Charleston, South Carolina, and I tried to do the same thing there. A love letter to the place too, but here it was even easier to just sink into that devotion to those mountains, because I grew up lots of different places, but primarily I was born in Washington, D.C., but primarily grew up in the East Tennessee mountains, but worked a lot of summers or visited a lot of summers when I was little, the North Carolina mountains. And then as a young adult worked there for a number of camps. And sort of any excuse, any camp job you wanted to give me, if it was an excuse to work in the North Carolina mountains, I was in, candle making, sure, mucking out stalls, absolutely, whatever but the one summer that it really clicked in my brain that someday I'd really love to write about the Biltmore was when I was actually had my favorite job title ever. Maybe not my favorite job, I think that's writing, but favorite job title ever. I was the head sailing instructor at Lake Eden at Camp Rockmont in Black Mountain, North Carolina.
Don't you sound posh?
Right. It sounds like I would have had a little ascot, and not at all.
Which is, we went and saw the Biltmore. That's where we stayed, was in Black Mountain.
Did
so
you?
I loved when you said that, because I was like, oh, I love that area.
It's a great area. And truly, Lake Eden, it really was kind of, for a young woman in her, I was like 20, 21, it really was paradise. And just being out on the water all day long. And my job was just to help little boys, mostly little boys, some adolescent boys, but, learn to sail these very simple boats, So it was just so much fun. But I, one day after, kind of the end of the lessons day, some of my coworkers came running down the hill saying, hey, we've all been invited to Deanie's house. Come on. And Deanie was the girlfriend of the son of the man who owned our camp. And I guess I'd probably met her, seen her. I'd heard of her and knew she was this very neat person who was dating the son of the guy. And the son would show up sometimes on the waterfront, walk by or drive his Jeep by. Just kind of knew who they were vaguely. Just knew she was the girlfriend. But I didn't really care. It was free pizza, and it meant I didn't have to sit at the camp and compete with the boys, for the fried chicken for once. Because I don't want with a table full of 12-year-old boys who were very hungry, you're going to lose every time. So I was all in, free pizza, absolutely. Didn't care where we were going. Yeah. So I had 79 Zephyr And I mean, even worse than now, which I also just jumped out of the shower, but I was just out of the lake. I mean, fish fertilizer hair, ratty blue jeans, ratty Georgia Tech t-shirt. Don't ask me why it was Georgia Tech. I think it was in the dollar bin of, some. I never went to Georgia Tech. But I was just a dripping wet mess, but like, sure, I'm in. So I jump in my car, pre-GPS. So I had no clue where we were going. I was just following the guy in front of me. And we drive from Black Mountain to Asheville and then kind of go south of the city. Fine. And then we pull up to the huge entrance of Biltmore Estate.
Like, what are we doing?
Right. Why are we here? And I assumed I was going to have to turn around because I didn't even have my wallet with me. I guess I was driving without it. So nothing on me, not a dime. And I'm in this ratty old car with dents on all four, and I'm the ratty driver. And so I assume they're just going to laugh at me and wave me away. And the guard very deferentially waves us all in, car after car. And I'm thinking, what the heck? Why am I free into the Biltmore Estate? And what is going on here? We drive all the way through, but not up to the door. Was that your
first time there, or had you been there before?
As a kid, I think with maybe my mom and aunt and uncle, but I'd been there as a kid. But it'd been quite a while. And we, instead of going to where the mansion was, we kind of wind around some other roads, and we pull up to this little house, get out, and this young woman, exactly my age, greets us. That's Deanie, and she's charming and lovely and very hospitable. And we come in and we're chawing on pizza, and I'm slugging back, a case full of Diet Coke. And she is just lovely. But I'm looking out at her back window with this big plate glass window, and I'm looking out over these lovely fields. And it was kind of twilight, just gorgeous, kind of that purple haze we get in the mountains. And in the distance, not terribly far away, across these fields, is the only thing you can see is the Biltmore house. This 250-room castle, essentially, is her view. And at that age, 2021, my view from my little apartment, I mean, we're talking, it was half buried underneath ground. So my window was like this up high, and you're looking up into the bottom, the undercarriage of the cars. That was my view. And I just kind of was chuckling to myself, thinking, okay, we're in kind of different positions in life, but I wonder, like, why does she have this view? Is she the caretaker? Like, how do you get that? So, sign me up. What do I need to do? And so fortunately, before I could stick my foot too far down my mouth, which is I'm very, very good at doing, a couple of my coworkers realized I was completely the only one in the room who was completely clueless. And they're like, do you know who she is? No. She's Chuck Scruton. That's what I knew. And they said, no, that's Deanie Cecil. And it meant nothing to me.
Yeah.
They said, she's going to inherit the Biltmore estate. She and her brother are going to inherit the Biltmore estate. Their family owns it. And it was just one of those moments of kind of like, okay, I'm just eating her free pizza.
You're like, what have I said up to this point? Did I say anything silly?
Exactly. But I just remember being struck. Not only it was just so funny to me that we were exactly the same age, and really, she was so down to earth. My memory, at least, is that she was in kind of ripped jeans too. Just super, and super looked like the rest of us from camp, that were a sweaty, sunburned mess, and acted just as down to earth. But I remember looking out the back window and thinking, because I so loved those mountains, and being fascinated that this George Vanderbilt, all I knew about him at the time was just kind of culturally what if you ever live or work in North Carolina. Everybody knows just this much, which is, or more, but you at least know this much, which is that George Vanderbilt was this multimillionaire from New York who moved down and could have built his mansion anywhere in the world, but he chose these lovely mountains. And I just remember thinking, okay, this is fascinating that this guy who truly could have been anywhere, he could have settled anywhere. He had a house in Bar Harbor, Maine, and in New York City, but he could have built this anywhere, and he chose the exact spot I would have chosen, me and my little, fertilizer hair. I just remember thinking, boy, this would be a great setting for a novel. And he'd be an interesting person to research more. But he ended up, it was like 8 books later that I got around to doing that. But that was one of those early moments. Talk about seeds. That was one of those seeds of an idea of like, okay, I'd like to loop back to this someday because I'm fascinated by this place. Truly, it was the place that came first, but also just how interesting, how interesting that we would have.
Even like serendipity, because it's like, I mean, does it seem like you were always meant to write this novel because of all of that background? Like, did you choose it or did it choose you? Because
yeah, that it often feels that way. I am 1,000 years ago. I was a newspaper reporter for a fairly short time, but I think it was my husband who came across the great quote, or maybe it's from a movie, but the great quote that there are lucky reporters and there are lazy reporters, but there are no lucky, lazy reporters, which I love, that kind of like sometimes you get lucky, but you got to be out there working on things in order for those serendipity moments to kind of drop in your lap. And I try to, whenever I love getting to teach workshops or whatever, or retreat or whatever. And that's one of the things I really try to stress is, nobody from a publishing house is just going to call you up cold and go, hey, Erin, we love you to write, a 306-page novel, and we're going to give you this much money. That just doesn't happen unless you're a celebrity. And those ideas that drop into your head. Sometimes you hear a writer tell a story about, kind of this moment when out of the blue they were given a story, but usually it's when they're kind of looking for a story, or there are a lot of great stories. Mark Sullivan is a colleague of mine at the same publisher and has the same editor. He wrote Beneath the Scarlet Sky, but he tells the story. It's been a wild bestseller, but he was really in a dark place and desperate, and tells this beautiful story that it's better when he tells it. But a story was sort of dropped in his lap at a dinner party, but it was he was already a writer. He was already looking for a story, and he was in that place of just like, just, this is awful. What do I do? And there's something about that, I don't know, brokenness, or that sense of being open to what comes and just paying attention. There's so much of life that is just trying to pay attention to, whether it's a little footnote of research that's like, what? I never knew that. Or a story that someone sort of tells part of at a dinner party, and you think, wow, that's, and people don't realize their own family stories, are so rich. And someone emailed me this week, and her family left Cuba in the midst of a lot of pressure from the Castro regime, and sounded like she had a fabulous story to tell. It just, there's stories are everywhere. So yeah, it's
kind of like, it seems like a coincidence, but is it really a coincidence? It's like there's a couple books, and they've turned them into like Hallmark movies where they're called God winks, where it's like it seems like it's all these strange coincidences that just can't, how could that be, or that all just line up, but really they're coincidences.
Right. Exactly. I really had that experience with my last book, A Tangled Mercy. And that's a whole other story we could chat about another time. But the timing on that one was crazy, with some things that happened where, just crazy timing, where you think, okay, I don't really know why the timing, but I'm grateful. And
or maybe proof to you that, like, yes, I need to be the one telling the story, or like that just shows me that I'm heading in the right direction. Or
right. And it can be really humbling, because it's, as you said, to be the one telling a story, and sometimes you kind of feel like, why should I tell this story? It's like there've got to be better people out there to tell this story.
What did I bring to the table?
Right. Right. It's easy to let your insecurities just sort of take over and paralyze you because, you know, that maybe there is someone who in another world, in a perfect world, might be a better person, better situated, better, to tell that story. But if you're the one in the midst of stumbling onto these ideas or this research or whatever, then
Right.
you have to take it as a gift and walk humbly and listen to other people and move forward because it's easy. I think most writers struggle with insecurities or kind of voices in your head that tell you, what are you thinking? How deluded are you? Why don't you just go back to, serving pizza at Pizza Hut? Quit
Well,
getting.
probably feel like some internal pressure with this book in particular too, because some of the people that you were writing about, these generational Appalachian mountaineers, that were these hardworking, fierce, proud, independent, resourceful people. I know you've said that they kind of reminded you of some of the people you grew up with in Eastern Tennessee. So it's like, you probably really truly wanted to represent them well because these were people that you grew up with and were familiar with.
Yeah, that really I did feel that tension on both sides. And I guess I did feel a little bit like Carrie McGregor, in that, her dilemma of feeling like in some ways I fit with this world and in some ways I fit with that world. And where I grew up was in East Tennessee, just mostly my neighborhood was just very middle class. And then there were some fairly wealthy folks on what we call the front end of the mountain. This is a little town that sits above Chattanooga, Tennessee. And on the backside of Signal Mountain was this community, Walden's Ridge, that kind of beautiful summer homes that the wealthy folks of Chattanooga and
I heard you say Signal Mountain, so that's where her brother got that from.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, fine. I just saw that connection.
You miss nothing, Erin. That's extraordinary. But there was a woman named Emma Bell Miles who was one of the inspirations for Carrie. She was a historical figure in the same time period who, in the early 20th century, she herself was well educated, but she fell in love with a mountain man in my little town, Walden and Signal Mountain, and married him and really struggled. It wasn't just a Hallmark movie where, and they lived simply, but they were so happy and,
Right.
he really struggled with poverty and he drank too much. And sometimes it was wonderful because they had this very passionate relationship, but sometimes it was really hard because he didn't share her intellect. And so she wrote beautiful poetry and there's a book about her called Spirit of the Mountains that includes her poetry. But anyway, I was just so aware of the folks I grew up with where truly some of the girls, especially, I look back and think of several girls who kind of disappeared during middle school.
Oh.
And I sort of, I don't know, how stupid was I guess just not to think about it much. And, looking back, I wonder what happened. Did they get pregnant? Did someone not care if they went to school because they were girls? But they were very much from what we called, the backside of the mountain. They were more the mountain culture, the descendants of this very, very proud, preciously independent. But anyway, it was, even in my little town, there was this kind of cultural not meeting of the, you had your wealthier folks and you had your kind of solidly middle class, and then you had people living in tremendous poverty with even outhouses and no dental care and moonshine stills. There were stories of people who would just be out. I don't think I ever stumbled onto a still, but we hiked a lot, and if you stumbled onto a moonshine still, the kind of general wisdom was you do not tell anyone because it was considered, we had a friend whose house was burned down. He reported something that he saw. And so anyway, but you had, even in my town, which wasn't that long ago or that far away, you had that clash of culture, the kind of suburban, everybody goes to college, clash with the we drop out before we graduate from high school because what really matters is the land and family and, um, so anyway, so I had that very much on my mind and really trying to make sure I didn't just create cartoon people, that trying to see the dignity in someone who wants to hold on to their land and to whom money means nothing. And there really were, I may have mentioned this to you once before, or maybe in that panel, that there were a number of families who, at least toward the end, Vanderbilt was trying to buy up all the land and have it be this contiguous, estate, where they just money did not think. And Vanderbilt and his manager, Charles McNamee, kept raising the price and raising the price, and they didn't care. Money was not the point. This was their family farm that had been handed down from generations, and they loved where they were and they weren't moving. And, I love that kind of response.
Yeah,
because
can't be caught,
Right. I love that. And, but you also appreciate the vision of a George Vanderbilt where he, in his mind, long before, the word sustainability was cool, he was trying to create this sustainable estate where everything they ate came from the land that was grown there on the estate, and all the animals came from there, and everything. Oh, and the forestry, the land was pretty ruined at this point. It had been overfarmed and overforested. And so he created the first forestry school in the United States. And so they were replanting all these acres and acres with trees to revitalize the land and putting the kind of trying to put nutrients back in the soil. So there again, just this fascinating sort of, putting myself in the shoes of people who would have lived there at the time. And on the one hand, be really kind of frightened of the trains coming in and all these new people coming in and people who didn't look like me. And, what does that mean? And being maybe resentful of someone coming in with so much money that he can afford to just buy out all of my neighbors, and thinking that I'm just going to roll over and play dead, if I'm given enough money. And then also trying to imagine what it would have been to be just so desperately grateful that what if I didn't want to farm the rest of my life and we were
right
in existence and my kids were hungry all the time and cold in the winter. And, a lot of these farms in that area were not the gorgeous, picture perfect, James Harriet sort of, Yorkshire moors and these lovely picturesque farms. A lot of these folks were just barely surviving. So how wonderful to have someone give you money for it and you kind of get to start over with what you're going to do, or maybe have a chance for your kids to be educated in the local school now and they don't have to work the farm every day. And so anyway, I just love those sort of tangents. I used to say in creative writing classes that when you think about where a story begins, it's not to say the cat sat on a mat, whatever, that's just a description, that's fine. But when you say the cat sat on the dog's mat, that's the beginnings of the story. And that's how that's how one thinks about here, that, the cat was sitting on the dog's mat, or at least the mat that the dog wanted. So,
right
anyway, right. Does it go from there? Yeah.
Well, when you were talking about kind of the people that lived on the land for generations, it kind of reminded me, when I was reading the book, it put me in mind of like Dolly Parton and her family, because like anybody who's like studied her and her background or watched like the Coat of Many Colors series and things like that, she established her famous imagination library in honor of her father, who was illiterate. And these, like you said, blue bloods that were coming down from the north, a lot of them looked down on some of the people on the land, just because there wasn't like there was a lack of higher education, or there was a prevalence of illiteracy. They took that to mean as inferior, and whatever they viewed as improved and better, and improved and different wasn't always better. They thought, some of these advances in civilization, building the estate and whatnot was on the backs of these people and through some of their, forced and unwilling sacrifice. So I kind of love how that you kind of emphasize, like, just because it's viewed as improved, it doesn't mean it's better. You kind of showed, like you said, the growing pains and struggles of this nation, that was, fighting through, like you said, these industrialization and the advancements, and at the same time as America's being woven into this tapestry of all these cultures and beliefs and things like that. So I thought you truly depicted kind of these growing pains of this particular, like, region and area.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. And that's true. I thought so much about just how any of us react to change, because of course that's, change is just part of life. And how, when do you resist change because there's some sort of overarching, principled reason? And when are you resisting change just because it's scary and not familiar? And, so I really just find that fascinating to think, even in our culture of, and that, as you say, that, building an estate on the, that moves people out, and you see in our cities, when does gentrification create this great new neighborhood with lots of cool coffee places we all want to go to, but who is it hurting? All those sorts of questions that we've still got to keep asking. And, and they were asking those questions at the time, and you end up with this, fabulous estate that now employs, it's, I think, the top employer for Western North Carolina. It's certainly one of the top employers for Western, so employs, thousands of people. And a woman who wrote to me last week worked for Biltmore Estate for years until the pandemic. And it was very sweet. I was so glad because I've never been on the inside, looking out. And she said, we were treated so well. The family was so kind to us. And even when it was clear, the pandemic was going to be a problem, anyway, she just described being treated very well by the family who owns, my close personal friend, Deanie, her family. But they apparently were very, very kind and very, anyway, from her perspective, it was interesting to get an insider's view of what it was like these days to work for the Biltmore. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of, we talked a little bit earlier about Carrie. In the book, you talked about how she was one who is known for not missing any details. And I would kind of argue that you're kind of the same in that respect, because you were very, you were able to really create, and through all your descriptors and visuals, like a world that the reader could really see themselves in, like this world that you created, from like your food descriptions to like Aunt Rima's, salted pork and fried apple biscuits, to like the visuals of these like misty, majestic Blue Ridge Mountains. And then you created, like you kind of just talked about a second there, this upstairs, downstairs Downton Abbey kind of feel to like the residents and staff of the Biltmore. And so I didn't know if like this was this detail orientedness, if it was born out of your love of research for like period details, or out of your love for like 19th century literature writing style, like kind of where does that detail orientedness come from? Because it truly did, create this world that was beyond just facts. You know what I mean? It really helped with the authenticity of kind of the book, and really allowed the reader to like escape into it, and just created this whole world.
Oh, thanks, Erin. And we've already seen how much you notice, which is everything. Which I don't do necessarily. I'll see things and notice things, but do I remember it? That's a whole different question. But, I on the negative side, I've read so much 19th century literature that it can really create problems. So for me, what feels natural, my editors would tell you, is describing a tree for like 5 pages. No reader in the 21st century is going to put up with that. And, I'm trying to realize that my sense for rhythm might be a little more the 19th century kind of, and so realizing, trying to be humble to realize, okay, I have to listen to my editors if they say, getting slow here, Joy,
Yeah.
come on now, let's move things along. And, and listen to readers when they're kind enough to, tell you what they like um, but some things I myself am just so interested in. All that detail stuff is just because I'm fascinated by, what did the carriage really look like? Or what did that, and then you have to be careful not to say too much because, the reader doesn't want to sort of think, oh, here she's spilling out her note cards, on this page.
Right.
That's dull. But some things I have to force myself to think in terms of, like, visually, I could describe all day, or smells could describe all day. But my husband challenged me a couple of novels ago. I guess he must have read an early version of Blue Hole Back Home was my first novel to be published. And he said, do you realize that no one actually eats in your novel? No one eats a thing ever. And as an Italian, he's just, food and how food tastes and what experience. That's sort of the center of life, and
Right.
draw out of food memory from 30 years ago and tell you exactly what he ate and where he was and who was there. And, I'm like, why? I don't know. I think there was a nice restaurant and, I'll have remembered the conversation maybe, but I'll have no clue what we ate. And food just somehow for me is like, who cares? I'll
Right.
skip into the writing or reading or whatever. And so things like that, I've had to realize I love it when I read it. As a reader, I love to know what were they eating or what did it smell like. Or so there's some areas where I have to remind myself, like, okay, someone needs to eat. No one eats food, So I had to, like, for this one, spend a lot of time. And it was fun on the Appalachian side and the Gilded Age side. Like, what would you, if you lived on this subsistence farm, what would you have eaten that you could grow yourself or slaughter yourself? Or, if you were very, very desperately poor. And then on the Gilded Age side, looking at old menus from the Biltmore or other Gilded Age families from exactly this era, these 7 courses, literally, 7 courses where it just blows your mind that people sat still that long, and just how did you not just gorge yourself anyway? But that kind of thing ended up being great fun. But that some of that comes naturally, and some of that you have to be reminded by loving people in your life who will speak up and tell you.
So he probably loved all your descriptions of the, salted pork fried apple biscuits. And he probably loved that whole cookbook that you have on your website for book clubs, like you said, of choosing different foods that could create like these meals that, people were eating during that time. He's like, okay, you're on my page now.
Yeah, right. Listen to me. Yes. And it's a shame. It's, obviously during the pandemic right now. So most people can't do this in the way we had envisioned it, but someday when we're able to get together in person, the idea that whoever's hosting the book club, could either choose the Appalachian, approach or or pull out china and crystal or whatever and kind of do the Gilded Age menu, but or a little bit of both, or have people bring things, or we had pictured for a launch party. My local indie bookstore is Parnassus here in Nashville, and they're fab. They're so great, and so supportive. And I had pictured for before COVID hit that maybe the launch party could be, even asking people to dress up either as one of the Gilded Age folks and farmer folks, and kind of see. Years ago, we had at my house a Downton Abbey party back when that was all. And it was funny. We told people they could dress upstairs or downstairs, however they wanted to, come as, whichever part of the society you'd like to. And everyone there showed up, top hats and, dressed.
Really?
Except one person, my mother, showed up dressed as a maid. We all laughed about, okay, well, at least one person here is humble enough to show up. The rest of us had to laugh at ourselves, realizing we all pictured ourselves, of course, as part of the upstairs. And not realizing that, of course, most of us would have probably been the downstairs.
Right. When we did it, my husband was a downstairs, but I think it's more the fact of it was just easier for him to come up with that costume.
Right.
Yeah, he just had a tuxedo like the other guys and all that kind of stuff. So I was Sybil, and he was like her husband, the chauffeur, because he could do it like with the hat and the suspenders and the So, but I think it was more out of lack of ease of costume, not having to wear a tuxedo or having a tuxedo or something. So do you or your husband, are you got either of you like really good cooks or like master bakers or chefs kind of like?
He's really someone who loves to think about food all the time. I mean, all the time. He loves going grocery shopping, and that may be one of my least favorite things to do in the world, I'm embarrassed to say. But I really, like, early in life, as a young adult before I was married, I literally would survive on like Cheez-Its and Diet Coke. And I mean, just awful processed stuff, terrible Pop-Tarts. And in fact, back when I was working for Camp Rockmont for boys and the whole Biltmore era, I every morning had a Diet Coke and a chocolate fudge Pop-Tart every day for. So that's what we're working with here. It's really sad. And but a number of friends along the way have been I've been really struck by how they turn their love for cooking into this really welcoming, open table chance to have people come and mix, people who wouldn't ordinarily cross paths. And so I've been really, over the years, I've kind of, especially when I had kids, my husband and I both cook, and I've been really struck that the difference between bringing in takeout and everybody, gobbles it up, goes to their own, separate corners and goes back to whatever they were doing versus a meal prepared with care and, from scratch, and all how long people will linger at the table and talk and tell stories. And I love that. So, I've kind of been trying to challenge myself over the years to be more respectful of the, kind of the art of cooking and hospitality. And I can at least do the hospitality end. I can think, how do we bring people together? And
well, I was just like what you said, since it's pandemic and people didn't really get to do like the whole book club, like, because you have such an amazing on your website, like you said, the cookbook and the questions and just the history, like all the things that could just make a great book club night. So I was like, well, maybe like you and him, if you were cooks, could like do a recipe like each week or something from that and post it. Or like if you're not big cooks, maybe like either your friends, or you could put out the recipe and then have people video and then send it to you and you post it, or something like that, where like, because it's like it's it's like, because it's like you just, it's so much work that you guys have put in on that it's like, that just, I think it would be awesome to like, like you said, how can we spin it virtually to still put it out there kind of thing.
That's a brilliant idea, because that's that's been, of course, a challenge for all of us, and I guess every person figure out, okay, how does this work virtually? And writing, in some ways, the writing part is pretty easy, but the connecting with readers part obviously has been a challenge, because I especially when it's such a solitary profession, and you sit, this is my little attic office, and you sit alone, just you and your dog, and all day just with your laptop. And so it's usually such a thrill to get to go to a book, some kind of conference, literary conference, or go visit a book club, or but just show up in person is like, yay. Human being,
or like be like, okay, you lived with that book for that long, like, are people going to get it like I get it, or what are they going to think, how are they going to take it, like, just hear the reader's perspective, and they probably come up with stuff that you're like, I never even thought of that, like I wasn't even going that way. Or
they do, it's fun, and readers come back with their own stories, which is really fun. I love that anytime you tell a story, you often get a story back. And so that's always fun too, that it'll remind readers of either a family story they wanted to tell, or it'll remind them of, it's just fun. I love it when readers are engaged, and hopefully they like your book, but also, it just kind of breeds creativity. So suddenly they're thinking, I hear probably every book club, someone there will say, always wanted to write a novel, and I have this, or I have this family story handed down, or I have this, and that's really fun. Anything I like to think, anything you can do to kind of encourage other people
Inspire.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So are stacks of your books hopefully being carried in like the Biltmore shop and the like all the indie bookstores in the Asheville area? Because I could only guess like, obviously it appealed to me because I mean I visited Biltmore and I loved it. But for people and readers who haven't been, I can't see how it wouldn't attract them to want to come visit, like with like you said, with the vivid descriptions that you give of like the rooms and the estate and the details of the construction and the people and the land, like, plus you spent all those hours like writing at their stable yard cafe, like, pouring your, into the laptop with the surroundings around you. And then, on your website, we talked about, you have this wonderful book club kit where, links are direct to their website to learn about the estate and family history and to have virtual tours of the area. So I'm like, I can only think that these indie bookstores in that area or the Biltmore would have your book up right now. So do you know if that's the case? Or
Well, one I know about, I'm not sure about the Biltmore. I love their little bookbinder bookstore there. I hope they're carrying it by now. I haven't been back um, since the book was published. So, but I love that little bookstore. Um, but I know, since Black Mountain, there's a great bookstore there. I'd love to get a shout out for Sassafras on Sutton. I don't know if you've been.
cool. No, I don't think
Oh, it's exactly, if I were to open a bookshop, it's exactly what I would
that's
ideally.
what yeah.
They've got great coffee, not just, they've got an urn of coffee just in case I mean, they've got really good, like a coffee bar. And then they've got the most interesting mix of, classics and bestsellers. And I mean, it's just fascinating. And they've been great. They've been very enthusiastic. So they have.
Let's shout out to Sassafras on Sutton then.
Right.
Can people get like signed copies of your book from there, or where can people find signed copies? Probably Parnassus too, I would assume, but
they can through my website. If you go through my website, there's a place where it sends you straight to Parnassus. If you need an autographed copy, it sends you straight to Parnassus, which is my indie bookstore, as you know, and they have a stack. They always have a stack of signed copies that they can send. And if you need it personalized, I love to get by there anyway, so I'll make an excuse to go get coffee in the area and go run by and personalize a copy, and then they send it out. And then Sassafras on Sutton has a stack of books that they ordered, but then I've signed a bunch of these autographed plates.
oh, awesome.
That they've got autographed copies, so that's a good way. Or also, if anyone who, like, if you're going to buy it on Amazon or something, I'm always happy to mail a reader. I have I guess it's on my website, is a post office box. If you mail a self-addressed stamped envelope there, I'll be happy to mail back an autograph plate, because that is more fun for a gift, especially.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But it does make a more special gift, and that way you can even personalize it. And I was doing a signing years ago with my very first book, and at some big women's book fair kind of thing, and the woman signing next to me was also a fairly new author. So in order to attract people over, she was calling out, "If you let me sign your book, I'll write anything you want to in the book." What? I mean, she had a long line of people. Just, it was hilarious. She was writing all these just outrageous things about, it was thanks to you that published. And, I mean, just hilarious. It was that moment in the attic, Jenny, that it was
hilarious. What's the craziest thing you've ever had to write? Have you ever been asked to write something crazy like that?
So I mean, people will, people will joke about, like, be sure and include there that I was important to the development. I mean, just kind of, and sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's a close friend who actually was important to my not just, jumping out a one-story window by chapter 5 when I became so. So sometimes
or
it
it's
is
like, oh, these 5 minutes we've met have been like the best ever.
right, right.
So yeah, we should send like a shout out. Like if anybody watches this and if they're in the Asheville, Black Mountains, Biltmore / area, if anybody sees your book out there besides at Sassafras on Sutton, post it on your page and tag Joy so we can see where all the places it's at.
Absolutely. It is fun. It's fun when you stumble across it. I always forget to do this, but my oldest child is always reminding, in fact, all my kids have a better business brain than I do, but the oldest child is always reminding me when we travel, Mom, take your books and then just leave them, at bed and breakfast, wherever they have shelves of books, or leave them in the cute little, VRBO house.
Leave them to the front of the shelf.
Never remember to do that though, but it's always fun. That's a shame about the, Kindles, as much fun and convenient and fabulous as it is to have a Kindle. I do make a lot of judgments about who someone is when I go through their books, when I'm sitting in the house and kind of like, let's look.
It tells you a lot about a person.
You can't always tell that when you can't, they don't leave their Kindle open for you to be nosy and go through.
Well, and I was going to say too, like for all the people who are like going to be in book hangover mode when they finish your book and they're like, well, what now? I wanted to definitely end on like what are like kind of what the next projects are, what people can kind of look forward to. And we know somewhat of the details. So I was going to see like within the confines, of course, of what you're allowed to say. I'll tell you what we know. And then you tell us if there's any new details or details you can maybe fill in past that, which you might not be able to. First one is you're gonna have a second children's book coming out in the fall, following up on the heels of your first children's book success, A Crazy Much Love. So that's one thing. And then the second one, there's going to be a historical mystery series that's going to be set in Maine around 1950 after World War II, focusing on a character, Amy Stillwell, who loves books and art. And that's all I know. So
Great.
Is there anything else to kind of let you on top of that?
Well, I can tell you with a children's book, it's called Sir Drake the Brave, and the woman doing the illustrations is amazing. Her name is Susan Eady. So if you Google her name, Susan Eady, it's EADDY. Website is actually claythings.com, but if you Google Susan Eady,
is it like a claymation type thing?
It's amazing. Just these vibrant colors. She makes everything clay and then photographs them, and I don't even know I want to watch her process. But she's a friend for one thing, so that makes it even more fun.
Yeah.
I know the person, and she's a fabulous, super warm, very kind person. But her art is just amazing. So I can't that and a portion of the proceeds from her and from me will go to a couple of different organizations that help kids who have prosthetic limbs.
Oh, wow.
Well, it's been kind of fun because the main character is based both on my son, my middle child, when he was a little bitty thing, had these, fears at nighttime, as a lot of kids do. But we developed this kind of story we told. So that's where the original story came from, was my son putting him to bed at night. And then a good friend of mine, one of my best friends, Elizabeth, has a son who is adopted from Haiti and has a prosthetic leg. And she commented one day how frustrating it was when he was little and she was looking for books to read to him, that there just weren't books out there, books with kids who had a prosthetic limb of some sort.
Right.
Occasionally you see a kid with a wheelchair or whatever, but very often the disability is the focus of the book. The kid doesn't just get to be the hero of a book, and oh, by the way, they, have something different. Very often, I think the current phrase is limb different, So that stuck with me. And so the main character, Drake, I hope, is just this charming, delightful, lovable little boy, but he has a prosthetic leg. And so that's not the point of the story, but it's awesome. Wrapped. So anyway, so I'm excited about that. And that's awesome. So I'm hoping by then we can have actually an in-person fun party around that, but we'll see by September. And then the one set in Maine, as you said, right after World War II. And yeah, I guess I can't say too much, but it's not the main character, Amy Stillwell, has discovered that, like a lot of women who loved their jobs during the war and had all this newfound independence, when the GIs came home, a lot of these
Like, we
women
don't need you anymore.
I very much see ya, and so she's having to kind of restart her life, and so it's if you like, for people who like the Louise Penny novels set in rural Quebec, I love those, and I love the way she does the seasons, and you have the village, and you have the mystery. So this is a little village on the coast of Maine, and I love the Grantchester series for anybody who watches that on PBS. So there's a little bit of that sort of similar time period. I originally this was gonna be, finally, I was gonna get to do contemporary fiction, and I originally wrote it that way, and it just didn't work. And it, with the pandemic, I was trying to write as if the pandemic was finally over, and it just didn't work. And it's been so much fun to make it also a historical mystery. It's kind of a nice world to go into, where there are no cell phones, there's no email, there's no, it's not idealizing that time, because you've got a lot of racial tensions. You've got, for women, all these challenges of not even being able to get your own bank account, those kind of challenges. So not idealizing the time, but just, if you're like me, sometimes you're just kind of weary of social media, and you're weary of always being available for, all hours. And it's just kind of fun to move into a world where my challenge is trying to figure out, but wait, how is she going to get in touch with him? Because a cell phone, or, oh gosh, what is a lab where, you can't just do the DNA sample, and okay, how do they, I'm having to think in a very elemental way, even how people communicate. So it's been fun. It's kind of getting to take a trip. So I'm hopeful about that.
Do you know how many it's going to be? Like 3, 4, or we don't know how many?
How many
book series?
Oh, good question. This one actually hasn't officially sold yet, so I'm hoping jinxing it to even be talking about it. But I'd love to put out one a year and just see how long we can.
How weird would that be too, to know, like, okay, I already know I'm going to be having a book every year for the next X amount of years coming out,
Right.
Well, we're putting out the good juju. Like, we're like the secret. Like, we're putting it out there, so it's going to happen.
I'm willing to put you in charge, Erin.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to end on with Under a Gilded Moon? Anything that you'd like to put out there that we haven't talked about, or?
Oh, good question. I just, I love to hear from readers. I always so appreciate the readers who take the time to post reviews. That's always a great gift. Remind people to do reviews, and I have to remind myself. I just did a review of. I have a friend who just did a children's book, and just reviewed it last night. So that's always a great gift. And it's just always fun when somebody takes the time to contact you, like through your website. And I don't know, I think the woman who does my website is incredible. Her name's Judy Collins, and she's commented, she's a good one about contacting writers to tell them if she likes a book and why she likes it and all. And she often says, I'm shocked when I get these letters back from a writer kind of saying, you have no idea how much this means to me. And I'm like, yeah, it does mean the world. It's, John Grisham probably didn't have time to respond to everything. For the rest of us, it's like, that means so much that we connected on some level, or that you shared this experience, or you love these mountains, or you've always been fascinated with the Gilded Age, or you appreciated there were some social justice themes that we're still wrangling with today, or what. It's like, it's that, yay, we connected as human beings, that really kind of keeps you going, because otherwise it's a tough profession for someone who's a little more extroverted or very extroverted, because you simply do not get your work done if you don't lock yourself in the garret,
Yeah.
and just keep grindstone. And so, it's a great privilege because you can travel and keep working, and it's a lot of fun, but it's lonely. And so it just means the world when readers like reach out and say, hey, here's what I liked. It's just like, oh, what a gift. Thank you.
Well,
But you're extraordinary, Erin, though. You have, like, on so many different levels. You're
thank
this,
you so much.
what you notice and what you think about, that really is amazing. So
Thank you.
I had
Well, thank you. And thank you for being with us here today on the Erudite Bibliophile with Wanderlust. And we look forward to these next ventures that are coming up.
Thanks so much for having me, Erin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joy.
Bye.